So this is again a welcome to the OZTalmud Beit Midrash, and I'm excited and dedicated to teaching 66 sugiyos that educated Jews should know. And of course, I've been saying 66, 66, 66 at Route 66, and someone brought me a sticker about Route 66, and someone brought me an ice cream thing that's 66. Of course, like there are going to be so many more sugiyos than 66 because there's so many intertexts and there's so many sugiyos that are self-referential, and you can't possibly learn the Gemara without understanding the intertextuality. The one sugiya relates to a different sugiya, so we're in for a treat in the sense of how sugiyas and the Talmud's built and how there's cross-pollination with ideas of the rabbis and sometimes what the sages say first and sometimes what God says. And it's exciting that way. The text is an exciting text. The Talmud, we used to introduce the Talmud and say the Talmud was the Mishnah, which was really edited and confirmed as canonical in 200 CE with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And we used to say, and then the Talmud as a project, the Babylonian Talmud particularly, is a Talmudic project that lasts from 2nd century to 8th century or so. People aren't exactly sure when it ended, but that's not the way we introduce it anymore either. There's been a lot more research. There's been a lot more reconceiving of what the Talmud really is. Speaking of the Ashleys, Mark Ashley talks about Professor David Weiss-Halivni. We've learned Talmud with Professor Shaya Cohen in our time at the Schechter Institutes at the seminary. Professor Weiss-Halivni was at Columbia. We've learned Talmud with greats around the country. Daniel Boyarin on the West Coast at Berkeley and Jeffrey Rubenstein here at NYU. And we see that there are elements of the Talmud that are literary projects that use literary frameworks in the way that ancient literature was composed when it came to the more agadic parts of the Talmud, the legends and the tellings of tales. And they can be seen as literary units. And sometimes we didn't pay attention to that literary piece when we were interested in the construction of the rhetoric, of the hermeneutics, of the way that a verse was maybe taken out of context. We still have to know what the rabbis are doing when they're doing exegesis and taking verses and learning from them and using them to narrate their own stories in a way that might rip the context right out of the passages. In that sense, the first sugya we're going to be dealing with from AvodahZarahpp, from the tractate named Idol Worship, really is a literary unit. It's the only tractate that begins with a literary unit right at the beginning, after a little bit of discussion of vocabulary, which we're going to kind of skip through. And those of us who learned this a couple of years, we might remember some of this, we might not, but we're going to be into a depth here that this sugya will take us several weeks to get through, I imagine. And we have to remember that when we introduce the Talmud these days, we also don't say that it was only from the 2nd to 7th and 8th century, another one of the ideas that we've upended, because some materials goes back to centuries beforehand. And we're bringing in elements of midrash, which could be halachic or simply agadic, telling tales or stories of individuals or different customs we have, or proving it through a certain type of halachic hermeneutic, meaning we're going to prove that this verse tells us that this law is the kind of law that we have to keep. There were legends back when that get beefed up by this fact that we frame them the same way that Talmudic literature works, but really the kernel of the idea is as old as, say, the earliest Tanaim. We still break the sages down into the period of the Tanaim, which is 100 CE to about 200 BCE, 100 BCE to about 200 CE. Those are the Tanaim. Those are the Mishnaic sages. Those are the sages that have what to teach when it comes to what we call Braitas, texts that didn't make it into the Mishnah, texts that are not exactly the Tosefta. Sometimes they are in the Tosefta, which is a Mishnaic age alternative code and textbook. We're going to call the Mishnah a code and a textbook at the same time, because there's an argument among scholars after all these years. Was this a law code or was this a textbook for your judges? And did they use it the same way we use textbooks, then to bring in other real live experiences that relate to either the theological ideas or the legal cases or the laws that were created? So the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and other texts that got left on the cutting room floor, to use the film kind of metaphor, those are all your brights, those are your Tanaitic pieces of literature. And when we start with a Mishnah, we start with a Tanaitic piece of literature. That 350-year period. Talmudically, again, having recognized that we borrow sometimes from even the Tanaitic era, or we borrow from what might have been around during a pre-Tanaitic era, and we move it into a Talmudic framework and a Talmudic framing and an exploration of certain verses that is structured now in a way that the Talmud presents it, but might have been around in a way that people told the story again and again before it got told this way on our pages of Talmud. That project is really taken up by what we call Amoraim. Those are sages that function between the years 200 and the year 800 and plus. And we have editors of the Gemara, and we think we know Ravasi is among them. And then we have anonymous layers of the Gemara called the Stam, and we know that they put some of the frameworks of the way the conversation and the diyun, the back and forth discussion of laws happens. And lately, what we've also realized is that what we have to really understand is that certain manuscripts include certain words and certain manuscripts don't include certain words. So when we introduce the Talmud, we're saying we're introducing this Talmud, this manuscript, versus another manuscript. And something as simple as the name of a sage, if it's not the same name as the Vilna, the version that we're using in the Schottenstein edition, or as I'm going to put on the screen, the edition that Rabbi Steinsaltz used with the Koren Publishing House. And we know from a scholar that there's an alternative name of a scholar that was in a manuscript. That makes a difference. Or we know that a certain part of a midrash was included in one manuscript, but it was excised in another part of a manuscript. That might tell us something about the time period in which the people creating the manuscript live, not exactly about the production of the original sugya. Because if they don't want to offend someone with a punishment that, say, happens to some nation of the world, like at the end of our sugya that we're about to learn, and they don't want to include that someone gets really badly punished and burned by some fire, they might excise that from one manuscript while it's included in a different manuscript. So the idea that we can understand where the story ultimately starts begs the question, who was the audience? Was this a text written for people, and people decided to sit down at a house of study? Or was it an oral text presented in the context of the early synagogue life? That, again, has been authentic. We've said this for years. We've known this because of certain scholarship as well. The synagogue culture is a lot earlier than the destruction of the temple. And we have to remember that, because the synagogue is a place where people met and heard oral teachings on holidays and during the year. The Talmudic culture, we thought it might have been only on certain holidays that we had drashot, for instance. Maybe it was Pesach, Shabbat Hagadol, maybe because of all the laws. Maybe it was only on Yom Kippur because of the liturgies in the temple. That we had also the coexistent Torah readings and retelling of what the Kohen did. And that's really like, we still read what the Kohen Gadol, what the service was like in the temple, right? Maybe that was the ancient place where the Mishnah actually took its form because they codified it. But there's some theory now that even Gemara, Talmudic literature, was spoken to people at study houses and may have been the fodder of homiletics, may have been the fodder of sermons of sorts. And that the lessons that we record, like at the beginning of Avodah Zarah, this is one of them, was really somebody's great Sukkot drush, which is a very different approach than the Mishnah came around the 2nd century. And ultimately, there's deliberation on the Mishnah. And that leads to a tangential retelling of a text that includes exegesis of certain verses from Isaiah and the Psalms that tell us about the fate of the nations of the world in the eschaton, in the Olam Haba, in the next world, which is what our sugya really deals with. It might have been that was a drush that someone heard at the holiday of Sukkot. Keep that in mind as we begin our passage. The first passage that we're going to study of the 66 is, interestingly, the first one that appears on the list. It has an A at the beginning in English. And so it happened to be Avodah Zarah came first. The list that I'm working from Hebrew U, from the Mandel Center, posted by a scholar at Brandeis, who was a part of the project, really goes according to the ABCs, the alphabet that we use. It doesn't go according to the Hebrew alphabet, and it doesn't go according to the order of the Masechtot, the natural order of the tractates. And I was speaking with someone, I can't remember among the crowd here who it was, about, are we going to go according to that list? Are we going to go according to the different kinds of ways that the Mishnah is classically organized, and the tractates then fall into place because there's 63 tractates of the Mishnah, and there's Talmud on most of them, and it starts with blessings. But we're going to actually start on an A and not the B of blessings, which is really the blessings is the first sugya. We get there soon enough if we stay on the ABC track. I have not yet decided on that, though. I'm going to leave that open as to which is number 2. But we're going to start with number 1, which is the number 1 on the list because it has an A at the beginning, which is Avodah Zarah, foreign worship or idol worship. And we're going to jump into the text and see what it's all about. And what I'm going to do is share the screen and when we have texts to study. And I need a verification that I'm doing the sharing right, because it's been a while since I've used Zoom. So people on the screen who I still see, good. Diane, thumbs up. Judy, good. I saw you're in the boxes.
We did this one.
And we're going to do it now with a whole lot of more kind of going into the soil of the great courtroom drama sugya that opens up Avodah Zarah. It's the only tractate in all of Talmud that opens with an agada. It opens with a tale to tell of sages and nations in this case, and God as an actor, as the ultimate judge, and it riffs or moves into that space after opening with what sounds like a very typical Mishnaic passage about avoiding idol worshipers on their festivals, because we want to avoid idol worshipers. We said when we learned this a couple of years ago that the Rambam sees many, many categories of mitzvot in the Torah that you might not think of as immediately being, against idol worship, as really being against idol worship. Like, love the Lord your God. Is that against idol worship per se? Well, he says that's about Amunah, but the equal and opposite side of faith is rejecting all potential idol worship, which was a big problem if you open up and read the Book of Kings in the Bible. It just wasn't easy. We kind of let other idol-worshiping nations' ways of doing the religion business into our lives. 51 different mitzvot. And by the way, we say about those 51 different ways of not doing idol worship that here we have, right in the first mission of the tractate, one way to avoid idol worship. Matniti, the Mem Tav Nun Yud of the Mishnah is matniti. So it is that we teach. Matniti. Lifnei eidehen shel goyim shlosha yamim. On the 3 days before the festivals of the Gentiles, here's what's prohibited. And Steinsaltz, for those who have not used this new Kli Kodesh, this new holy book, puts things into idiomatic English, just like Schottenstein does and did. And it's based really on Rashi's commentary or the Tosafot when he puts in the idiomatic translation. A lot of times it's also based on his own Hebrew work, which was produced and it exists on our shelf. And he narrates the Gemara before the Schottenstein did it into idiomatic modern Hebrew. And so he has a way of integrating the commentators, and he has also a way of just explaining what the inherited tradition of the Talmudic literature is really about. So why is it that on 3 days before festivals, here's what's prohibited? Because it would bring joy to the Gentile, who would subsequently give thanks to his object of idol worship on the festival. Now, he uses a confusing set of terms. A lot of times in the class, we stop to say, what's also kind of either problematic or spurs of thought when it comes to the translations that we have on the table. The word Gentile for us has a much nicer tone and should have a much nicer tone than idol worshipers. And the rabbis made a big distinction between the two. So big that we have to stop right away when we're using a translation and say, first of all, this is the first sugi on the list. It happened to be an A, but it's an amazing place to start because the Jews' particularism in a world of lots of different kinds of people, especially back in the biblical age, between us and idol worshipers, is seen as much different than us and Gentiles. And especially the Gentiles who were alive in the great age of Talmudic learning of the commentators Rashi and the Tosafot. Gentiles, non-Jews, who ultimately recognized, like the Noahide laws asked them to, that there's one real God in the world, they do not fall in the category of idol worshipers. And so really, you know that old joke that, the Jews, there's the Reform, the Reconstructionists, the Conservative, the Orthodox, the Modern Orthodox, the Open Orthodox, the Chassid from Plutz and the Chassid from Mutz, and Hatzaplatz and Planka, and there's a Litvak, and there's a Hungarian, and there's a Western European, and the Russian, and there's the this and that, and there's one word for all of them, Goy. But that doesn't work. That's not really true. Sometimes there is truth to jokes, because by the rabbis, at least by the time that the rabbis really create the Talmudic culture that we consider Talmudic culture with Mishnah, Gemara, and now add Rashi, the commentator, who's always on the inside of the page, and the Tosafot, who are Rashi's grandchildren, who are looking at various passages of the Talmud and linking them together and saying, okay, really, does this make sense? Because over here, I think it didn't say that. So what are you going to do with that now? We really have two kinds of different, categories. They're not all goyim. There are goyim, and there are idol worshipers. And idol worshipers are seen by the rabbis and this is where we get down to the truth of telling about rabbinic culture and what the Talmud and what the Mishnah really defines. Idol worshippers are seen as people we needed to avoid. Cultures that didn't have the rules that we understood to be good rules of Hashem. Either 7 Noahide laws, the ones that were given to Noah, which again, we'll get into a little bit because you have to know those laws before you get to a piece of our story now. And so we're going to go to Sanhedrin, another tractate, where we're going to see what that's all about to understand what's being said over here. And we also have to understand that in the Middle Ages, especially, because we have the commentaries on the sides of the Talmudic page from the Middle Ages, that there's a group of people who are not only seen as Gentiles, but you could call them righteous Gentiles. We do business with them. They help us with enough of our own economy that we are able to interact. They have a culture that we have encounters with, and they encounter us, and we have friendships, a la the vocabulary of friendships, who know you well enough, because we learned this on the page the first time around, that they knew if you sold it to them on this holiday. Even on the holiday itself, say the Tosafot, a Jew sells something, they know I'm not selling it for worshiping their version of God or any idol. They know me well enough. I'm a Jewish soul in the same marketplace, in the same town that they live in. And we have these relationships. Now, that's the beautiful piece of the social reality and the sociological reality that comes across as we go through. We'll point out where those things are. The rabbinic theology is a little different. To be true to the understanding of the Sugya, we're going to have to go into the rabbinic theology and try to understand, at that time, in the rabbi's mind, they're dealing with still pagans who have a very different sense of morality, exhibited by their willingness to put not only animals to the fight to the death in the Colosseum, but let's just say the violence of, let's call it the gladiation that they put on show. That if that's the way they're willing to see people, that's fundamentally different than the way we would ultimately want our systems of justice to work. And we know that throughout history, the pagans, the idol worshippers, were the ones to make sure that the Jewish people were either enslaved or could not inherit the land as God had promised. And there were all kinds of great dramas of history that we know as Tanakh literature, the Bible literature, that really reflect the kind of values and attitudes that make up the whole canon. The whole canon, remember, we said Mishnah and Talmud because we're learning Talmud. It includes the Tanakh that was canonized in and around the same time because it's a referential book. And it says all the history that we think it says. It's also not positively historical all the time. It gives a sense of the traditions that were passed along. And the use of the Tanakh literature, again, to take things out of context and to learn new lessons, is a project of the Mishnah and the Talmud. Here, they pick out one of the ways that you can really avoid Avodah Zarah by not selling to the idol worshiper 3 days before a festival. And you have to imagine a Romanesque kind of marketplace. And you have to imagine Sasanian Persian that kind of looks similar to Roman kind of culture, but with its own twist from the world of Persia, now updated, because they're arguing about who's really in control by that time, the Sasanian Persians. And we're not able to engage in business. Asur l'seit v'latedi mehem. It's prohibited to engage in business with them. Lahashilan v'lish'ol mehen. To lend items or to borrow items from them. Ulahalvotan v'lalilvot mehen. You can't lend money to them or borrow money from them. Repay debts or collect repayments during these particular days. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, when Rabbi Yehuda says, major sage of the Mishnah, Nifrayin mehen, one may collect repayment of debts from them, because this causes the Gentile distress. He wants to repay you. People want to take care of their debts. They don't want to be debtors, right? Nice little nod to the sense that, those of us who live with the financial stress, right? Isn't it really nice to actually just make the payment on time, to get that payment, to repay, to be done with that debt? Little human things like that come out in the Mishnah all the time. And we see that they're just as deeply flesh and blood and human as we are. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Nifrayin mehen mipnei shemeitzar hulo. We do collect amrulo afal pi shemeitzar hu achshav sameach hu la'achar zman. But the rabbi said to Rabbi Yehuda, so here's the alternative, even though he's distressed now, when he repays the money, he's happy. And if he's too happy, he's going to go party about his, idol worshiping festival now in a deeper way. So really, you're going to let him collect and you're going to let him repay the debt and you're going to collect from him, because that's just as bad as selling. So the rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda have this discussion. And by the way, there is no resolution of the issue. And we always are going to mention when sometimes we do have resolutions and it seems like there's a bright line in the law. But when Rabbi Yehuda speaks to and the Chachamim speak after, unless you go with a proposed rule, which some people have, like Jacob Neusner, the scholar, would say, since the Chachamim had the last word, we go with the last word of the Chachamim. But if we only have two opinions, and we know it's Rabbi Yehuda versus the Chachamim in this case, it might be an open question that could come to be adjudicated another time by some other commentators. And that is, can you collect or can you not collect? Or you might be able to rely on one opinion in this area, and you might be able to rely on a different opinion in another area. And we have to remember that local authorities used the Mishnah and used different positions in the Mishnah, majority opinions, minority opinions, just like we do today. That is a feature of how Mishnaic law worked. We recorded minority opinions, we recorded debates and disagreements, and especially in our orbit as a community, our orbit between the university style of looking at halachic history and the seminary style and the Ziegler School style and the Schechter Institute and the Hebrew University. You could find ways to prove that thousands of years of halachic history, some of them relied on one opinion, some of them relied on another, but I won't go into specific inyanim. Those are side notes to explore for a different time. So those subject matters. So that's the Mishnah. And I'm going to stop here and stop the share. I'll take questions about my introduction. I'll take questions about the introduction of the Mishnah itself, and we'll just do a couple of pauses for those who are not kind of with a text of your own. If you need me to flash the text back up on the screen to ask your question, I'm glad to put the text back up if you tell me to, and we'll go from here. So Dale, start us off.
Two questions, actually. I'm surprised at your comment that there's no decision, because I thought that usually, I know that the minority opinion is used when there are extenuating circumstances, but generally I thought it goes with the majority opinion, the rabbis, and especially when they come last. So that's one thing. The other is you started to talk about a idol worshiper versus a Gentile, and here Steinsaltz is using both in his translation. I happened to look at I pulled up Sefaria so that I would have my own text, and it says Ovdei Kochavim and not Goyim. So that was interesting.
Yeah, no, thank you for that piece, because we're idol worshippers versus Goyim versus nations is really one of the Mishnaic differences. So you have Eidehen Shel Ovdei Kochavim in your Girsa?
But Ovdei Kochavim, yes.
Yeah, so that's one thing. Dale is pointing out that in the text, I'm going to share the screen for a second. If you take this word, goyim,
right,
And that is just Ovdei Kochavim again. That's idol worshippers. You don't have this problem of Gentiles because the way we translate Goyim. So there are different manuscripts. And so one gives more of an open door, by the way, to the Middle Ages openness to the Goyim, saying, Edehem shel Goyim, the festivals of these peoples, of these Gentiles, are not like the festivals of Ovdei Kochavim. But we are talking about Mishnayically and rabbinically idol worshippers. Goyim might be a signal that we had a little bit of a change of approach when certain people were considered, as the Meiri famously said, Begader Hadat. They're within the boundaries of our monotheistic religion. And remember, he says that about the Muslims and about the Christians we live around in terms of the 14th century text that we see that he develops, the commentary he develops, quoting from someone who came earlier, the OZTalmud66Sugiyot. And he puts certain Goyim into one category and leaves Ovdei Kochavim in the category of those idol-worshipping pagans of the past. So it could be that the manuscript has a change based on some of that kind of signaling of vocabulary and what it means. On the Chachamim, the reason why I'm saying that we can't say hard and fast that the Chachamim's opinion and Acharei Harabim Lahatot, they'll asked about a principle. Don't we always incline after the majority? Well, it's not just sometimes that we could use the minority opinion when it comes especially to loans and these kinds of things, which we won't go into the depths of looking about how this Mishnah was applied in Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. But Jews like to collect their money. Let me just leave it at that. And since Rabbi Yehuda said you could collect your money, it was used quite a number of times, and not just like as a total exception. Let's just put it that way. Diane.
So, in reading this right away, I immediately thought of Christians, and I'm gathering that they weren't necessarily seen as idol worshippers. So
early Christians were kind of seen as even practicing Jews many times, right? There was this group that was a little bit more fluid that had Jewish ways about them who were messianic. Then it crystallizes, and for a long time, you could say that Christians were considered to be others, and they were considered to be others in the sense of Oved AvodahZarahpp or Ovdei Kochavim, in the sense that they were alternative. And the word goyim, just to get back into that vocabulary again, might be because it wasn't exactly pagans, and there was a rabbinic tendency to still say these early Christians were really not people we could do business with. We were too concerned that they were turning some hearts. And then finally, when we are in the theater of the Middle Ages and Christianity has really taken hold, we are in a certain way subject to their hegemony. We want to have a different relationship. And between the Shitat HaMikubetset, as I mentioned, and Meiri, who then is really on the page in our tractate, on page 26 in our tractate, he says, these are not the same goyim, these are not the same people as Oved Kochavim, as idol worshippers. So there's a little bit of history in there where we can trace a little bit of a relationship where it's opening up, but probably in the centuries of the Mishnah and the Talmudic production of the texts, they were very much at a distance, Christians. And they weren't saying, let's just be open to that, the way that they're going to express it come 13th century, 14th century. Rachel, did I see you had your hand up?
You did, but I just had more on the theme of Abrahamic religions versus other religions as goyim versus idol worshippers. So you pretty much addressed most of it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for noting that we've addressed it and we can move forward, because that's also important as a mode of study together. And Ron, I know you had a hand up before.
Yeah, you mentioned before that idol worshiper we should avoid. So why we shouldn't avoid them for the whole year? Why just 3 days before their holidays?
What did he say?
Well, that's a good point.
Could you repeat it?
So why only 3 days before their holidays do we not sell? But why do we say that it's okay otherwise?
Business.
Now, business is business, and the marketplace.
I was in business. I was in business 45 years, and I chose my customers.
Yeah,
And there were people that I decided not to do business with.
Right.
So,
And the business practices of folks could be just like yours, or you could be in a marketplace where there's lots of different cosmopolitan marketplace where there's lots of different folks, and they're not going to limit you entirely to do business in other times of the year when there's not festivals and when those things aren't going to the use of these, special on a silver tray, place this for the god of whatever. When they're thinking about people being able to make a living and do business, they're thinking about the general practices that are around at that time. You could be very careful. That could be your mitzvah. You could never sell to anyone but a fellow Jew who's going to kosher that chicken. You sell chickens. The chickens were we said the poultry of the ancient world. That you could get a dove now and then. You could get a quail, but chickens were around. So you might be really careful, but it doesn't mean you have to be extra careful, like 3 days. And they made boundaries so that they really avoided people participating in the festivals and in the celebrations of those neighbors who were committed to these other religions. Bobby.
So are you really talking about idol worship? Because in terms of art history, the Christians had lots and lots of idols. They were filled with idols. There's a choir screen, there's a crucifix, there are chapels alongside, there's Mary, there is patron saints. They are three-dimensional idols. There are candles that are votive candles in front of a saint. So you can't exempt the Christians in terms of idol worship, and particularly the Middle Ages and before. Even the Gothic churches are filled with it. So if your definition is idols and worshiping, the Christians really had them all over as part of their life and religion.
I'm going to relate to Bobby's question by way of the time period in which Christianity is really developing, and then like Diane, you asked, versus the time of the Middle Ages, which they got a little bit more mature about their relationships to Christianity, despite all of the relics, the art, statuary, the iconography.
Right.
And so I will say that at first, they were more inclined, according to scholars, to say that the Christian way of setting up a church, the Christian statuary, the cross itself, all things that you couldn't even bend a knee for, that you had to see some of the early sections of this entire tractate, if we were going to learn through it, as be careful. You drop something, don't bend down in front of a cross. Someone could think that you're bowing like they kneel, like there's early bowing, hishtachavut, for them and to their God. And you don't want to ever do that to a representation. By the Middle Ages, again, that kind of changes. And what's amazing about it is that you have an entry in the middle of Avodah Zarah. And there's only a few times that we have this kind of complete text. Whoops. We have a text from, as I mentioned, Meiri. And he says this on the page. Just to bring it home again. I've mentioned it outside. I'll take you inside the text since we're talking about it. Ra'inu, harbe ra'in. We've seen many times. Shemit pal'im.
Right.
Al shebizmanim elu we're very surprised that during this time, Ein Adam Nizhar Midivarim Ha'elu Klal. A person's not very careful with keeping 3 days before the holiday and not selling. Where there's a Tosafot, Rashi's grandchildren, on page 1. This is, we're not into our sugya yet, by the way. This is how Gemara works, folks. We're not into the passage that I'm going to start, that is the story piece, that's like considered the first sugya of AvodahZarahpp. We're in the first Mishnah. We have to understand the background of the Mishnah in order to really understand the context of where we're going with the Talmudic passage and the sugya. So we're here for good reason. The Tosafot will say, Afilu b'yom eid shelahem. Even on the day of their celebration, you could sell. You got business to do. You want to take care of the research project, close the deal with the insurance. You want to make the deal with the lights. Folks, go ahead, because these days hem kulam me'umot hakidumot shelo hayu gedurot bedarkei hadatot, because the people we're talking about not doing business with are from earlier peoples that had no relationship at all to any rule of law or morality. We're talking idol worshipers from peoples long ago. And for the Meiri to say that on the side of a Gemara and give Jews the kind of space and permission, this is what the great scholar Jacob Katz wrote about exclusiveness and tolerance. That's the title of his book. Maybe some of you have studied a part of that when you were in Maya, or you were in some of the JTS continuing, what do they call the program? The one time it was this, and then another time it was that. Or you went and took a class in Jewish studies. You read Jacob Katz. Yaakov Katz wrote a book, Exclusiveness and Tolerance. And he's really quoting this passage.
Like me.
What's that, Cheryl? Cheryl, did you say something?
Drink and I'm gonna go to bed. I can't keep my eyes open.
Okay, so this book, and that's why this is an educated Jew needs to know this sugya, because when you talk about Jewish life and it being the Jewish life of the European theater, you talk about the moment of real mindset shift in the Jewish people's attitude about the neighbors that live around them, because they're figuring out a way, they're working out a way to live with the Christians around them and the Muslims. 13th, 14th centuries, Iberian Peninsula is rocking. It's a great place to live. And so is Europe. For some, it's post-Crusades. They remember. We've got Kaddish. We've got Yizkor now. We've got charters, though, and we've got certain people who really will invite the Jews to create, even though we have a natural migration across Europe. By the way, when we're expelled, we have to leave. It happens. But we have a different relationship by way of the Meiri bringing the Shitat HaMikbetzet, who says these people are Begader Hadatot. These people are monotheistic. These people are our neighbors. These people are not the idol worshippers, who we are going to essentially say are the other umot, the other peoples who were everything from the empire builders, the conquerors, the anti-Semites. Even though we know what anti-Semitism looks like and what it is, nobody's got the term yet. Remember, that's quite a modern term. Even though we know what it means to write the tefillah that God should avenge the blood of our martyrs. Av harachamim, say Yizkor for all those who perished. Poetry for Tisha B'Av, that includes from the temple to the Crusades by this point. we also feel an openness and we're looking to build a relationship. And that's where Professor Katz will say in Exclusiveness and Tolerance that we have to really try to do this. And one of the ways we try to do this is through the Beit Midrash and through great leaders like Meiri, who comes out with this ruling that they're really within the framework of our heritage as a monotheistic people. They understand mitzvahs that were commanded to Noah and his children. We also can still observe Torah and be the Jewish people we need to be within this theater. And that's a pretty amazing move. And that's why the beginning of this Masechta might be just an amazing place to start on our journey here, because we have that as an underpinning value. We can still be the Jews we need to be when we are in that mode of tolerance from our side, or making bridges and figuring out what it is we share and what it is we do not with the cultures around us. And like I said, we're going to get into the passage here in Avodah Zarah. The Sugi is going to start. And it's not the most tolerant Sugya of the world around us. And we have to ask, why is it that the rabbis, still in their permissiveness on the page, on page 2 of the Talmud, there's never a page 1, by the way, for those who don't remember, they haven't studied Talmud in a while, there's never a page 1, because who can know page 1? We always begin page 2. Only God knows what's on page 1. So Daf Bet is the beginning of every Masechta, and that's why we're studying page 2a right now. Second Daf, side A of the folio. And that's a really interesting dialectic. There's an openness on 2a in Avodah Zarah, but now we get into the meat of this passage, this Agada, this legend about what happens in the eschaton, in the world to come, when God ultimately calls all peoples to judgment. So that's where we're headed, okay? Barry's got the last one, and then we're going to push into a little bit of that text before we end tonight, so that we can say we're starting into the Sugya, and we're on the route.
So, stimulated by Mark Ashley's presentation about Halivni, I went and started to read some of his work, and he made me think hard about something that, frankly, I hadn't thought hard about, and that is the role that the sages play in the whole issue of revelation. We obviously have whatever happened on Mount Sinai, but now we give so much authority to the interpretations of the people we're reading.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that they were a special group of people who were designated to participate in revelation? Or in which case their views deserve special consideration? Or were they just people, and therefore their authority is not the same as someone who in fact has super powers of interpretation? And I really started to think a lot harder about that, because of the implications of then how much, as you was just said, Meiri is the Middle Ages. He's a long time after these guys, but he's saying something very different from them. And now who decides whether or not, if they're super interpreters, can you really even do that? If they're not super interpreters, then why can't anybody even today do it if they've got a better argument? So I just, and I don't want to divert attention, but I because I started to struggle with this. I just be.
I'm going to give a short answer to it.
Yeah,
but it's a deeper mission. We recognize immediately, especially in the world of biblical studies and Jewish studies, as we receive it and accept it, that revelation could have happened. Heschel says it's all midrash afterwards. There was a divine presence in the world, we began to then discern, what does God want from us? A restatement of that position was made in a much different biblical studies kind of way by our friend, Dr. Ben Summer from the seminary, where he's called Torah the first Talmud. And then the Mishnah and the Talmud, the subsequent interpretation by enlightened religious souls who had a certain mindset and zeitgeist. They inherited it, but could break on through to the next phase of religious consciousness. Phases of religious consciousness and discerning God's will and believing you were discerning God's will was probably deeper than modern scientific approach to Judaism folks from the School of Wissenschaft in Germany starting in the 19th century. There's a great tradition of received tradition and respect for it in our circles and Jewish circles that was much more fundamental than some other circles. And perhaps as a part of the great consciousness of religious people, it was more important for the survival of culture as a production of humanity than simply coming up with a new idea, right? And so between culture and between knowing how to navigate within the bounds of what you think God might want from you, it grants a certain kind of authority to people. And Amcha, the Jewish people, definitely feels coerced into following it sometimes, as evidenced by sugiyas that say, like, God put the mountain over our head and said, want the Torah or do you want to die? But maybe that's also, as I've often said, a positive question. If you don't have Torah, you know you'll die. So they rose up and they received it in the time of Esther, when they were just simply blended into society, right? That's the short answer. And we can continue to have that conversation. So the first sugya that we're getting into goes right from that Mishnah into a moment when the world to come is here. Now that's really amazing to say, because a lot of times what we'll say is that the ideas about the world to come in Judaism are not so fleshed out. We did study several years ago in the Beit Midrash the last chapter of Tractate Sanhedrin, which is also about the rule of law and courtroom drama in both civil and criminal realms. The last chapter of that book is all about Messiah and all about what's going to happen potentially in the world to come. And by the way, when we get to the S's, if we're doing ABCs, we're going to Sanhedrin. An educated Jew needs to see what's going on in the world to come according to Sanhedrin. But we're not going to be there. We're going to get a view into what's happening right away in the world to come from our sugya. And we didn't kind of pick it out like that when we studied this, because what we said, it was more about the relationships, the social relationships that I described before. The Jew and the others in the marketplace, the Jew and the others in the marketplace of Roman Palestine, of Sasanian Persia, of the Middle Ages Europe. But really, there's a deep investigation in our first sugya about what happened immediately when Olam Haba is here. And what does it look like right away? What's the first thing that happened? What kind of demands does God make of us? What does God ask? What questions? Because it's a courtroom scene in Avodah Zarah. And God is sitting on a throne and has a Torah on the lap. And if you really think about what that looks like, it's not only a judge, but it's very motherly. Like Torah is a little baby there. And that's an image that certain literary critics have thought about. Because you have Avinu Malkeinu, you have our Father, our King, Hadayan, Ha'emet, the true judge, but you also have Ha'em Uvanav, the mother and her children. And B'nai Torah the children of the Torah, the children of Israel, are the children of Torah in that sense. And that's going to come into play as opposed to the nations of the world who are clamoring to get to God, to get their portion in the world to come. And that is the one intertext, and we won't go there right now. I won't show you this Mishnah tonight. But Sanhedrin tells us everybody's got a portion in the world to come. And the big question is over there, does that mean every Jew? Or are there versions that say everybody's got a portion in the world to come? And by the way, there are exceptions to who has a portion in the world to come. If you were a real idol worshiper, if you were a real evildoer, exceptions. So we're going to go and we're going to find now, and I'm going to show you by scrolling, we're not going to deal with the first issue. You should see the screen again, Diane, Ron?
Yeah, I can see it.
So the Gemara begins, and they're talking about vocabulary and Eidehen, which is about the words they use for seasons and the word they use for festivals, and is it an aleph or an ayin? And that's interesting because the very first thing sometimes is vocabulary work. But what we're going to do is we're going to start, see where it says the darash. It uses the very verb darash to say teach, but darash is a technical term in the Talmud that also means that I'm going to be involved here in the exegesis of certain verses. And you shouldn't expect, even though you know maybe the text and what the original context of the verses really are, what the different contexts are for the various verses I'm going to use, you shouldn't expect that the context is exactly the same. The question, but doesn't that verse really get used in a story about X in the book of Psalms or in the book of Isaiah? How could they do that here? The immediate answer is that's how they could do it, by using the technical approach of being doresh, of making midrash. They can take verses out of their context, use different phrases, and even use them as guideposts to build a new narrative and build a story. There can be resonances from original context in our story about, okay, if it was an argument about whether or not God was the top God of all gods over there in Isaiah, maybe I'm going to use the verses to see who's the top nation of the world and who really gets a portion in the world to come. So I'm going to rearrange the verse a little bit. And it was kind of related to the theme over there, but not exactly. That's though important to know by way of, again, how we are readers of the text. Darash. Darash. And in this case, darash, if we only had that verb and we had no named sages, we would be asking the question, from what century could it be from? Early Agadic and halachic, legal and legend kind of midrash. Come already 3rd century BCE, according to some of the scholars who think of the earliest kind of moves, that we are taking verses out of context and learning either laws or stories, building stories from them. Holy stories. Holy stories. Remember, I like to quote Professor Heinemann on Midrash. There was never more a holy word game than Midrash. There was never a holier word game than Midrash. Because sometimes one word, one letter, right? Here, different verses are used. But in this case, I can tell you that the theory is that this sugya comes from about 3rd or 4th century, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, because I have named sages who at this time, and I don't do this always in the Beit Midrash, but this one is very important because Agada is even more important sometimes than legal discussion with who's really reporting it and who's saying it. I have 2 sages that are named, and one is Rabbi Chanina Bar Papa and Ve'itema Rabbi Simlai. Now, what's fascinating about these 2 is that they're both 3rd, maybe 3rd to 4th century Amoraim. Chanina Bar Papa is known as a great storyteller. He's known as a very generous guy as well. Gives a lot of charity. And interestingly, I don't know how charitable. this sugya makes him out to be. Or maybe he's just kind of reporting it and trying to contend with the attitudes that are in it. Sometimes somebody might assert something within a sugya or a Talmudic passage, and we don't immediately associate that lesson that he's teaching as his ultimate position. There is some grappling with ideas, especially based on what sages' general suppositions are or what their dispositions are. We might say, oh, interesting that he taught it, because we know something a little bit different about who he is. Maybe he's grappling with the idea. What's interesting about Rabbi Simlai for our sugya's purpose is that he's known as the guy who counted out the 613 mitzvot. So there's some mitzvah calculating and general understanding that we need to count up the mitzvahs, 248 positive to do mitzvahs, 365 thou shalt not mitzvahs. And since he's mentioned, and again, first sugya, important to know, we want to know from who's the guy who really was doing the mitzvah accounting and setting out the table of mitzvahs, the banquet of mitzvahs for the Jewish people, and kind of categorizing them. Well, he was among the first. So, and here is in our sites, eschatology, thinking about the world to come. The eschaton. La'atid lavo, mevi HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Sefer Torah, umanicho b'cheiko. In the world to come, the Holy One, what does he do? Comes, lavo, that's the world that's coming. Mevi, same root. So in the world to come, God brings the Torah also comes, and it sits on God's lap. Very visual here, right? And God's holding it to God's bosom. Cheko. We say in terms of tefillah for the redemption of captives, we want them to be returned to chek mishpatam. We want them to be returned now and immediately to that inner sanctuary, that warm hearth of their family place. So the Torah is there by God, v'omer, and God says, L'mi she'asak ba, whoever or anyone who's engaged in the Torah study, yavo v'yitol sicharo. Anyone who's engaged in the study should come and take his reward. We're one paragraph into our sugya. And so we could say we're on the route 66. And I want to make the following last comment after you tell me what are the questions that have come up already in this passage. What image did you see? Is it surprising that we're already in the world to come? Give me a reaction, throw out a question at this point, make a comment, and then we'll wrap up for the evening. Can't believe it's 9 already. Yeah, Ron. You're on mute. You're muted. So I couldn't hear you.
Why did you translate לעתיד לבוא equal לעולם הבא?
That's the received tradition. You have to understand that certain phrasing in the Talmudic literature is received by everyone in the same way. So it's translated and understood to be exactly like that. So there's just no question. In a future time, you might be able to say, as if they were imagining from their time, which is, though, for the rabbis, in this sense, the eschaton. It's the world to come. It's olam haba.
Okay, in that case, you mean that everything will happen after everybody will die?
Well, I'm not sure, because we're not really sure what the world to come really means. There is a lot.
That's the difference between future and olam haba.
It might be tomorrow. But there's a lot of traditions about the world to come that people assume because they've heard one or another that we really hold open when we read texts about it. The world to come literally could come tomorrow, So it wouldn't be after we die. It could be generations after us. And the rabbis are mapping it out and telling you with some insight, maybe, I don't know. And so we have to really wonder, like, is this a picture? Is this a supposition? Is this a perhaps? Is this an imagined? What will be? So all those questions I want to leave wide open as opposed to lock myself into what they're really reporting.
My response is very anthropomorphic. Number one. Number two, I'm not sure if this will get me in trouble, but the image that comes to mind is Mary. Mary holds the baby here,
Right?
holding the Torah.
So
Yeah.
the Jewish image of the baby is no baby at all. And I purposefully kind of put it there, the mother, and said, the Jewish image is the law. The Jewish image is the Torah, the teaching, the wisdom. And so keep that in mind, because I think that does play into why it's here. And it doesn't get you into trouble at all.
Okay.
It's interesting that what gets you the reward for the Olam Haba is, at least here, is not the mitzvot, it's not the good deeds, it's the study of the Torah, the actual act of study. And I find it fascinating.
Good. So we'll actually ask, based on the language again of that first passage, does it mean study? Or what is asakba? And that's going to be one of our initial questions. So it does generally connote learning. But are we going to really hear that it was about learning? Or are we going to see it was something else? The rabbinic culture, and we've said this over the years, those of us who study together, they love to come back to learning, learning, learning. Learning Torah, learning Torah. That's rabbinic culture that they want to sell you on. But this case, just watch what happens with what kind of Torah God's asking about. Okay?
But then we're all on our way to after tonight.
Yeah, we're really on the way.
I mean, you get the sense
You
that
have a
there's
say,
going
like,
to
at
be
least
others
this much.
too, but this is the first
bad.
group. This is the ones that like get a free pass. But
Well, they're not even getting a free pass. If you've come claim your reward. What does that claim look like? What is God really asking somebody to do and ask for, and how? And so, make it a cliffhanger. Don't read ahead if you want to make it a cliffhanger.
Right.
So here we're going to be pursuing this sugya. And as a last comment for the night, to wrap up from my side, we have a Pirkei Avot Mishnah that says you should be involved in doing Torah simply for the sake of it. No reward. How do we hold a tradition like that and also hold the end of this first paragraph? Because we as Jews say both and. We as Jews can't ask the question sometimes, or we can ask the question, but how could it be that you could say this on the one hand in Pirkei Avot that you shouldn't work for the reward? Even in Pirkei Avot itself, it says the Baal Habayit knows if you're doing holy work, you're going to get repaid. You're getting credits and you're going to get paid. But at the same time, you don't do it for a reward. All of these are the great tensions within our tradition and the great both and kind of opportunities to at any given moment invoke one or another kind of outlooks that help us really keep to a culture of Torah and make Torah precious to ourselves. And we're at the beginning of the first sugya, that famous 66. Really great to see so many friendly souls on a night where we're also learning in real solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Eretz HaKodesh and Eretz Yisrael. We're learning in real hopes that those who need comfort through study and engagement will find nachama as they're mourning, and we're demanding the immediate release of hostages as a community. Tomorrow, we are involved with a worldwide public fast from sunrise to sunset for those who can really participate and do the spiritual work in that regard. We're having Shacharit here and extra prayers, and then Mincha is across town at B'nai Jeshurun with a grand community Hadar has organized, and we will be part of that tomorrow. So see you for holy occasions. Friday night too is a time we're going to be together in the shul and say a few words of chizuk, of strengthening, and Yom Shabbat, good to be together too for the beginning of Bereshit. All those times that we could be together, let's be together. See you for holy things.
Good night, Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
And everyone.